Oh no, I was just saying we can get started here.
Yeah.
So first, thanks to everyone that's here. Appreciate you. It means you're an insider, so appreciate that. Um, Kate, thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this.
Mm.
Okay, so to get started, my first question for you is obviously we're coming off a huge round of Supreme Court decisions. And if people want to know more about the Supreme Court decisions or what Kate wrote, you can go read the articles. But what I'm really interested in is before you actually write and do the reporting, how we as TPM actually decide to cover which cases and how we cover them. And really what I mean by that is there are so many outlets that cover the Supreme Court in different ways. So you have like SCOTUS blog, they just cover the Supreme Court from every angle. That's like their whole thing. Then you have publications that are more akin to trade publications who maybe drop in and cover a specific case as it relates to whatever their industry is or whatever their trade group is or what have you. And then within our world, within political media, there's a whole range of ways to cover it, whether it's you have like a dedicated reporter at a daily paper, or your Axios or Politico, you're coming at it mainly from like the DC Beltway vibe. So how do we at TPM and by extension, like you specifically, decide what to cover, how we're going to cover it, what are we trying to accomplish, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, what I cover has grown a lot because I wasn't necessarily supposed to become our Supreme Court reporter. I moved to DC in March of 2020, alongside the pandemic to cover Congress. And that just kind of like mutated a little bit because I found out that I love covering the Supreme Court. And Congress is so hamstrung from legislating, through kind of a combination of multiple veto points, the Senate filibuster, split party control usually, Republicans kind of like just lack of interest in passing legislation. So Congress, and this wasn't true for the first 2 years I was here because Democrats had the trifecta and there was a ton of legislating happening and that was really exciting. But as soon as the House flipped, it slows to such a crawl. And this is all happening with the background of the court becoming so powerful and having this conservative supermajority and really, reshaping American life. So I started to do more and more court stuff, and it became kind of a communion of things that I'm really interested in and things that are already in TPM's wheelhouse. So I would say primarily the cases I cover kind of fall into three buckets, which are, reproductive rights, the administrative state, and voting rights. But because I'm a sicko who loves oral arguments, I sometimes convince the editors to let me cover other stuff, which I think this term, that kind of miscellaneous folder, would probably have, the domestic abuser gun case and the ban on camping, which, affects homeless people. So sometimes I can kind of sneak in some other stuff too that I'm just interested in. And then sometimes, we talk about this all the time at TPM that we're very reader reliant in terms of kind of flagging things to us. And since I'm the only one who's doing almost all of the federal judiciary stuff, I'm not going to see every case. And we've had readers kind of write in before saying, this is important, this will have big ramifications, and it's flying totally under the radar. And that's how last term I covered this big Medicare case. And we were the only people covering that for months, like really until it got up till the point we were waiting for a Supreme Court decision. Medicaid rather. And that also put me onto a big Affordable Care Act case while it was still kind of percolating before it had reached the Fifth Circuit. So that's also kind of a tributary into how I get the cases that we're going to do. And then in terms of how to cover it, like you said, we're not a SCOTUS blog, right? I'm not trying to give people kind of a summary of the briefs. I think our coverage is best when we situate these cases and the broader movements around them, which is also why we cover the ones we choose to. So, for example, this term, we got a ton of attacks on federal agencies. And I really want readers to understand that, this isn't just kind of an attack on the EPA or OSHA. This is a kind of active front in this right-wing battle to dismantle the administrative state, to neuter Congress, to shift all this power to the 6 conservatives on the court, and that this movement has a really long and rich history, and that these justices come directly from it and are actively working to further it. So my favorite way to cover these cases are when we can kind of expose the machinery that's ticking underneath, and that connects the right-wing legal world to the political scaffolding that is, kind of helping further it, through these justices who are fundamentally political actors.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it segues into the something I want to ask you next, which is I find the Supreme Court, I don't know if it's totally unique, but it feels unique as an object of coverage because there's a mix of historical policy and just sort of palace intrigue considerations, right? Like if you cover, like if someone gets murdered and you have to cover murder, they don't readers don't expect you to understand like the history of English common law and why murder is
Yeah.
illegal. If you cover a sporting event, they don't expect your recaps to tell you like the history of the Super Bowl or like breakdown analysis of every single play. But with the Supreme Court, you kind of do have to have a history of the Supreme Court or those specific issues. You have to have a sense of who those people are and the machinations of the court itself and the policy stuff. So, how do you prepare to cover any given case?
So I read a ton, and the dockets are obviously very helpful, right? Because you've got both sides' briefs in communication with each other, and then you have all the amicus briefs. So you can get a really good position on kind of how the various political entities feel about this case. If it's something that applies to business, like, with the mifepristone case and the FDA, you have the pharmaceutical lobby kind of getting its voice into the ring. You've got doctors, right? You've got women who have used it. So you get a whole kind of spectrum that way. And then I always read reporting on it, any kind of academic work on it. I do a lot of reporting where I kind of talk to people who specialize in whatever issue area it is. And then you get to oral arguments, right? And I love oral arguments because you have time to sit and listen and pick out themes and flag comments, a little bit of tea leaf reading about which way people are going. You get to see the justices kind of interact through this bizarre intermediary of the lawyer who's asking questions when they're really clearly just kind of going back and forth at each other. And I can structure the story in my head as I go and figure out which entry point the justices are kind of interested in and what that kind of tells us about how they see this case. Now, as much as I love oral arguments, I hate decisions because I like being really, really well prepared so I don't have to do these like mad dashes to get the story up because, we're in a very competitive industry, and we're in an industry where when news breaks, it's a mad sprint to be, get your coverage up first, get your headline out first, get the clicks while people are interested. And since we are not just doing these kind of nuts and bolts summaries of the decision, we are trying to contextualize and situate and tell you why it's important. That stuff kind of takes time. So it's these like two kind of competing interests, which really stress me out. So there's also all this kind of behind the scenes kind of conversation because vast majority of these Supreme Court cases are coming down within these last 2 months of the term, which means we're often getting multiple cases per day, sometimes getting multiple of our cases per day. And since it's just me, we have to do this kind of on the fly calculation of what's more important, what do readers need right now, and what can I kind of wait and finish up in the afternoon. You have to read them really fast. You have to get your stub up really fast. There's this kind of paralyzing fear of, oh my God, what if I read it wrong? or didn't understand the full scope of this opinion until I get through all 125 pages. So, that's just kind of some of the behind the scenes stuff. And then when we were waiting for this decision, if our listeners aren't aware, you get Supreme Court decisions in this like antiquated dinosaur way, which is you just have the web page on their website and you just refresh, 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 refresh until you get the next one, starting at 10 a.m. And it's like I've got adrenaline shooting through my body, refresh, refresh. It's like, oh my God, there's a new one. And then it's like, okay, it's not mine. And then to add intrigue to it, the decisions come out in reverse seniority. So you can kind of calculate by the author what's left. And of course, because some of the kind of the big bads on the court who we consider Thomas and Alito are quite senior by this point, you kind of get through everyone, you get through Kagan and Sotomayor, and you're like, oh, great. All we've got left are those two, and then John Roberts, and then, the kind of rare per curiam, which is the whole court together. But so you get, when you're waiting on these big ones and that's all that's left, you're like, oh my God, right? Like if you see the Mifepristone decision come down with an Alito tag, you're like, oh, well, we're fucked, right? Time to just
Yeah.
find out the nature of the fuckery. So, basically by the time we get the decisions out, I'm just like kind of being a psycho, going over my notes, going over my outlines, reminding myself the fine points of the case, because also some of these decisions, they're coming out in the last 2 weeks and they argued them back in November or whatever. So, that's kind of how I prepare at that point. And the preparation for oral arguments is different than the preparation for the decisions. But, I think we do a good job in this year in particular. I took on a ton of cases, but I had been steeped in all of them enough that I knew their contours well. I knew what to be looking for in the decision, and that kind of building up effect helps me by the time we get to D-Day. I'm kind of ready. I know what I'm looking for.
So I was going to ask like what you've learned since you started covering Supreme Court, but I imagine like everything you've said so far falls under that bucket. So what are some things that maybe you've learned or that have surprised you or disappointed you about covering Supreme Court that people just it wouldn't occur to even people that follow this stuff pretty closely, but are not actually like a journalist kind of like doing the work.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, especially coming from doing more Hill coverage, is that the press corps is totally different. Like the people who cover the Supreme Court, it's this really, really small, limited knot of people that for a long time I think was dictated by these expectations that you are also a lawyer, right? That you went to law school and are also a journalist. And I don't think that's so true anymore. I say also self-servingly because I did not go to law school. But it's a small group. There's only like a dozen hard passes they give out, which are, give you access to the court every day. But you also had, right when I was kind of getting into Supreme Court coverage, COVID happened and this huge democratization of the federal judiciary. So prior to that, you had to go in person. And, I went and you had to take handwritten notes. You couldn't have any electronics. And then the mass of people run from the courtroom, all the reporters to the adjoining press room. And everyone is like typing feverishly, trying to get your write-ups up. And, while I was doing that, I was sitting right next to the sketch artist who was, drawing the court scene. So it was kind of surreal. And now you get audio streams. So that's totally different. That's opened up the courts to, more kind of smaller independent outlets like ours, which can't afford to send me to every Supreme Court case because I do a lot of other stuff too. And that has happened on the appellate level as well. A lot of, the Fifth Circuit has an audio stream. It's becoming more common. So it's easier to cover because prior to this, court coverage is just so favored, kind of the bigger, more well-resourced outlets who can afford to like send one reporter to Amarillo to cover whatever Matthew Kaczmarek's doing, right? Like we just don't have enough writers to be able to do that. So that was a huge kind of change in the way things were covered and expanded a little outside that very small circle. But it's a different beast, right? Because a thing that I don't like about Hill coverage is it's so access journalism. Like all those people are kind of running this really this careful tightrope walk of getting information from, members and staffers, but also not like pissing them off enough that they don't give you anything in the future. And that can be a really fraught relationship. And that's different with the court because, unless you're like Nina Totenberg and like best friends with RBG, most people are not ever going to get access to the justices in any meaningful way. Like you don't get to walk around the Supreme Court building like you do the Capitol and run into them and ask them questions. So it's a really different beast. And what I really like about it is I like the feeling of, kind of old school service journalism in terms of there's such a language barrier around the court. Decisions are written in this legalese. It's hard to understand. There's Latin phrases, right? There are balancing tests. There's heavy citations and footnotes. And I think that can be really off-putting to both readers and journalists, honestly. Like it can seem really intimidating and scary. So I like the idea that when I've gotten the hang of translating it, like I can kind of do an important role of telling you, okay, that's what this means. Like, here's what you have to take away from this and why it's important. So that's all been kind of really interesting to learn. And I'm glad I got to experience both, reporting in the legislative branch and the judicial branch because they're so different. But, one thing that I think is still happening on the judicial side, which is more baked in on the congressional, is the awareness that these are political actors and that their decisions are political actions. Like, I think that is still a lesson that is being learned by court reporters. And that is really being led by kind of the more lefty outlets that are being more plain spoken about this. Because, in Congress, everyone's a political actor, obviously, right? Like, it's not, that people are speaking because they need to get reelected, right? They need to raise money. That's baked in. But on the court side, for so long, we've had this kind of gods in robes thing, this idea of, John Roberts calling balls and strikes, right? And with the sea change of personnel on the court, it's kind of necessitated sea change in how we think about them. And that's like still, I mean, I just saw an article the other day kind of breaking down how it's a 3-3 court, right? How there are 3 liberals, 3 centrists, and 3 conservatives. And that's crazy. It's such a misread of the moment, right? And people do still have this kind of hesitancy in calling this what it is, right? These people are not these robotic, neutral arbiters. Like they came from a political background, they are advancing political goals. And, I think I'm glad that we at TPM, I think, are helping reinforce that lesson so that it can eventually become, as baked in as congressional reporting is.
You mentioned something that's really interesting what you said about how you feel like the people covering the Supreme Court are kind of catching up to the reality that it's a political institution. And I imagine, and as you said, like having covered political actors, inherent political actors like legislators, that helps you understand the court. So I'm curious if it's worked the other way, like having covered Supreme Court more, if that has altered or enhanced or just changed the way you view covering legislators and being on Hill and the way you approach that.
Yeah. So there's some things about the Hill that I really like that, as I just kind of ran down, it's not part of covering the court. Like, I love the physicality of the Hill. You get like 60 seconds with a senator when they're walking from the Senate subway to the elevator and they're like exposed, right? It's like you're
Yeah.
a predator. Like, literally, you just are mulling around waiting for them because you know when the votes are and they have to leave their offices and go vote on the floor. So you're all hovering, heads on a swivel, waiting, knowing which senators like to walk and which like to take the little cars. And so, I'm sitting there kind of muscles taut, say I see Elizabeth Warren coming. She always walks. So I know that if I go towards her down the hallway, I'm going to hit her before any other reporter does. And I'll have time to get in a question or two before she hits the elevators, and during specific times, like when I was there during the Build Back Better stuff, I mean, Joe Manchin would have 50 reporters ringing him at all times. Like there was a real risk that you would get run into walls and stuff when you were trying to walk with him. So I love that competitiveness. Like I love kind of being part of a group. When they get to the elevators, this is just a Hill kind of formality thing, but you have to ask the senator if you can go up in the elevator with them. And they can say no. But I love being in a group and being the first one to be like, oh, Senator, mind if I ride up with you? And then they're like, oh, sure. And I'm like, yeah, excuse me, everybody. I'm about to go have a little one-on-one here for a few seconds. So I like that stuff. I like that the Hill is somewhat democratic in terms of they have to talk to you, like
Mhm.
even though outlets like, Politico and CNN or whatever, they have massive Hill teams. So it's easier for them, right? They can station a person at every possible exit and be sure to get them. And it's harder for us because it's me and our colleague M&A. So, and before her, it was just me. And that is harder. You have to kind of hang out in the high concentration places and kind of just up your odds. And it's hard when you need specific people. And it's really hard on the house side because there are so many people there. But, I feel very lucky when I'm at the Hill because I am one of this very small select group that, the people who kind of run our country have to talk to. Like they
Mhm.
have to answer my question. And most of them, to give credit, do. Like you don't really get a lot of kind of no comments, or there's a handful of them who are like, well, I don't do hallway interviews, and they almost always get voted out, looking at you, Kirsten Cinema. So that stuff I love about the Hill. And I love this idea of getting to some degree. I mean, they still have a guard up, right? But I like this idea of getting to know legislators a little bit in terms of who's actually thinking about stuff, particularly the stuff that they're supposed to be thinking about, right? Like that they are on committees for, or that their state is really interested in, and who is just like kind of media savvy, kind of a fluent speaker, and then delegates all the policy stuff to their staff. And that becomes apparent like really, really quickly. So I like those pieces which are not present at the court. What I don't like about the Hill at all is what I mentioned. The access journalism stuff is just a disease there. It can be very high school. Like there's
Mhm.
a great sense of kind of who the lawmakers like of the reporting core. Um, Hill teams have, I'm saying a mandate, not specifically like a numerical quota, but they have to produce stories from the Hill every day, even when nothing is happening on the Hill, which is often not because legislating is so bogged down there. And I think that produces so many stupid stories. And that is kind of the fuel on which, your Politico, your punch bowls run, which is like huge premium on internecine warfare and drama and stuff that doesn't really serve readers, isn't necessarily newsworthy, is more personality based, and you get an awful lot of that because you've got to produce content every day, even when Congress is like very far from passing bills every day. So that's what I don't like about it. And my last insight here is that it is so difficult to find footwear for this job as a woman because men will wear suits and like dress shoes, or as more young people get into Congress, the nice sneaker trend is kind of taking
Mhm.
hold there too.
I gotta say, I hate
Even
that trend.
I think it's
I
so
hate,
ugly. I think I
I
can't
hate it.
shake in my head that you look like a commuter, in your
Yeah,
nice outfit with your sneakers.
yeah, yeah.
And there are some places, weirdly, the House is more strict on dress code than the Senate. And there are some places in the House where they're like, they won't let you in the speaker's lobby if you're wearing sneakers. So you have to kind of be strategic. But for women, it's a lot harder because, probably the go-to kind of professional shoe is some kind of heel. And the Hill it's the most like marble of marble floors. So
Oh,
you just can't wear, I love wearing heels, and you can't because like I will come out of there, hunched over like, a shrimp with osteoporosis because the material is just so unforgiving and it like really hurts your body. So I have kind of settled on, I have what I call my formal docs, my Doc Martens that are, they're short and they're shiny. And it's really funny because I swear to God, every single young member of Congress comments on them and likes them. And then from the other side, like Chuck Grassley's wife walked by me, she stopped and stared at my shoes for such an uncomfortable period that I was like, do I have to say something here? And then she just looked up at me and kept walking. And I was like, not a fan, not a fan.
Oh my God. Oh my God. That is, yeah, I can imagine. I think I remember when you got those Doc Martens, you were extremely excited, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they're my go-to now. They're what get me recognized. So
Okay, so across, on the Hill and with the Supreme Court, major focus of your coverage, as you mentioned, is reproductive rights. And so I'm curious, coming out of this most recent round of cases and with everything that's going on with the election, what are some of the issues, or maybe not issues, but like specific developments that are on your radar that you're watching into the future that people should have their eye on?
yeah, I mean, the obvious one is the political salience, right? And we're going into this election where, I think we'll get to this, but there's all kinds of fears and concerns. And the kind of the self-soothing little like childhood blanket that Democrats keep kind of going back to is like, well, we have the abortion issue, right? And we're having abortion initiatives on a lot of kind of key states. So it'll be just yet another test now that we're like 2 years out from Dobbs to kind of see how potent that issue still is. On the kind of legal side of things, we have this big bucket of issues that just hasn't really reached like the top of the federal judiciary yet. And that is going to be these state on state clashes because you have these blue states saying, abortion is legal here, passing these shield laws that say, our doctors can treat patients who come here from wherever, including banned states. That's in some states that extends to our doctors can telehealth prescribe, abortion medication for patients who are in banned states. And then you have red states trying to enact abortion travel bans. Our citizens of our state can't travel elsewhere to get an abortion. And those state on state clashes are relatively untested in terms of kind of our case law. And I think we'll almost definitely see some of those kind of rising to the top of the judiciary. And that's going to be really interesting because I mean, barring a national abortion ban, which obviously isn't off the table if the politics, fall right, that's what this is going to be, right? It's going to be an abortion desert, kind of stretching from the southeast over to Texas. And then you're going to have these little oases of not just abortion protections, but expanded since Dobbs access to abortion. And it's all going to be about how those things come in conflict and how safe abortion really is in blue states, or if, this court in particular tries to find ways to kind of chip away at that. And then on the political side, I think it's been fascinating to watch how Republicans are just twisting in the wind on this. It's such a case of dog caught the car, trying to find some kind of non-inhumane messaging while not alienating the anti-abortion activists who have so long been a core part of their party. And even more so now when evangelical Christianity is basically like a campaign plank. So that's really interesting. And that'll only become more difficult for them to do because, you know, they like the idea of leave it to the states, right? Trump loves that. He loves saying that because it sounds so reasonable and kind of understandable to everyone. And yeah, why not? Leave it to the states, right? But that's just not how it's played out in practice. With the mifepristone case, that was an attempt from these like well-established kind of right-wing entities to get the FDA approval of mifepristone revoked, and that would have applied, nationwide. And that's a huge deal because the vast majority of abortions are medication now. And then you also have in red states with these draconian bans. I mean, who does that hurt, right? Like we keep hearing stories about, children who were raped who are not allowed to get an abortion, or women who are very late in their pregnancies being forced to like bleed out at home because they got turned away from emergency rooms because they're not close enough to death to qualify for the exemption of these bans. And these stories are only going to proliferate. I mean, another case that we got this term, which the Supreme Court punted for now, but is going to come back, is about an attempt to ban abortions in emergency rooms. And that almost always applies to people who the anti-abortion movement would profess to support, which is basically women who really want their pregnancies, because this kind of emergency only happens really, really late in the pregnancy where people are not getting elective abortions. It's almost always a medical emergency. So, Republicans, I think, have really failed to articulate a position on abortion that doesn't alienate huge swaths of the country and huge swaths of their own base. And I think that's only going to get more difficult. And so the strategy of kind of like trying not to talk about it that much is not one that's going to work long term.
So in terms of of political salience, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the most politically salient question of right now, which is if you have a take on Biden. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot of like, should he drop out? Should he stay in? Just the whole thing, the coverage, the situation we're in. Like, do you have just a general take on the situation?
Yeah, I want to say I think this has been such a rough and grueling political time. Like for me, probably the most since kind of the since January 6th, I guess, and all of that stuff. The waiting to see if Trump would kind of try to launch a revolution. That was bad. But I think this has been so grueling because so much of what and I think a lot of our listeners and readers hate so much about politics is all converging, which is that you have the Politico punch bowl, politics is sports people like frothing at the mouth about this. And that gets a lot of people's hackles up. I think you have Democratic self-flagellation. That's not only like he should not only step aside, but he should resign and wear a hair shirt and apologize for ever getting involved in politics at all and maybe kill himself on the steps of the White House, right? It's just like a super anxious, like cowering position. You've got Republicans kind of throwing keggers in the background, which is, awful to everyone who hates Donald Trump. And then you have this flood of like stupid stories and gratuitous journalism, like waxing philosophic about, the quality of Biden's skin. It's just like, it's ridiculous. It's like opening up the floodgates to this, like, we have all these talks about journalistic neutrality, and it's like apparently fine to kind of hold forth about, well, his wife gave me a look and that said everything, right? There's like one person I'm clearly talking about in particular, but and then on top of everything, everyone on the left has just this gnarly scar tissue from the past few years and from Trump and from the constant never-ending threat of Trump. And that causes, I think, immense anguish and fear for a lot of people. I think that's manifesting as, for some, sympathy for Joe Biden, for some extreme anger at Joe Biden. So, it's awful. And you have to kind of endure this extreme anxiety while all the jackals are circling. And we've been in a limbo now since the debate where he says he's staying in. Democrats are like, we're going to wait and see what he decides, right? Like, not, the subtext is not very sub there. And it's, leading to this difficult thing where what I thought might happen is after the debate, we'd get a critical mass of just dreadful polling for Biden. Like the bottom has fallen out and he would be left with no choice but to step aside. And I think probably, people have these kind of ideas about kind of primaries, led by Obama and Clinton and blah, blah. I think that's just kind of silly. I think it would be Harris. But that didn't happen. Like the polling is kind of all over the place. It's really noisy. Some polls say everything's the same as it was. Some polls say he's down 6 in Wisconsin, and there hasn't been a clear enough response to trigger a reaction. And so we're in this weird place where then the Biden campaign, I think, skillfully for what their objective is, which is to keep him as the nominee, keeps buying him more time. So that's what this NATO presser was last night. It was, well, wait and see if he falls on his face at the presser. And I think, for Biden, he did well. It was much closer to the State of the Union Biden than it was the debate Biden. And I think if he had utterly collapsed there, maybe that would have triggered the movement, but he did okay. So now we're like, okay, now we're back in this limbo. And now he's got upcoming interviews with Lester Holt. And it's like, well, okay, maybe we wait and see how he does there. So it's just in this kind of worst of both worlds place where Biden's cognition is the news cycle every single day, and how Democrats are reacting is each one is a different story. You know, each different permutation of how Nancy Pelosi talks about this is a different story. So that's just where we are. And like, as to how we got here, I don't think it was this grand conspiracy where Biden staffers and high ranking Democrats are hiding from everybody else how old he was. I think when people get very old, they can go downhill quickly in different ways. I mean, that's something you grow intimately familiar with when you're on the Hill, because the Senate in particular is so old. And like, to some degree, I understand Biden supporters' frustration, because you can be a good president without the communication and public speaking skills that you need to be a good candidate. Like, those are two distinct jobs. And I think a lot of people don't really care how many hours he needs to sleep at night, right? Like, we do get taken in by this like great man theory, when in reality, you need an army of people to run a government. And I think, you know, Biden did a really good job as president. I think a surprisingly good job. That was like the most progressive administration of my lifetime. So there's all of that, and I understand people who feel strongly about that. But I think where I more come down is just he wasn't winning before the debate, and now things are worse. And the theory before was, well, he just needs to kind of change the narrative. And that's where you need those communication and public speaking skills, which he's struggling with. So I mean, the problem is we're in this anxious stew, and both paths are incredibly risky. Staying with Biden is risky. Switching to a new candidate is risky. We're never going to have all the information we need to make that decision. And I say we, but it's a very, very small group of people who are going to make the decision. It's going to be Biden. And then there are, I think, your Obamas, your Pelosi's, your Schumers. There are some really important Democrats that could sway his thinking. And I thought in some ways, some remarks he made at the NATO presser yesterday showed a little bit more openness to perhaps not definitely being the nominee than he'd showed before. There was one really good question that asked, if your team presented you with polling that showed Harris doing better against Trump than you, would you step aside? And he said, no, I would only step aside if I was shown no path to winning. And to some degree, that shows like you like that answer better than you like the, well, if I lose, I'll have known I did a good job answer. But I don't know if we're going to have conclusive evidence one way or another. And I think if he wants to, he'll be able to run out the clock until the convention by just kind of stringing out these, well, wait and see about this. Well, wait and see if polling gets worse kind of event. And at this point, I think the only thing that could change that is like mass revolt, probably led by vulnerable Democrats, and he joined by your Pelosi's, your Jeffries, your Schumers, the heads of the party.
So there's another say Democratic luminary that you've been working on a special project about. I'm not sure if you're allowed to talk about it, but you know what I'm talking about. So to the degree you can talk about it, now's your chance.
Yeah, so I am in the very preliminary stages of working on a book that is about the threat of violence against women in the public sphere that undergirds our politics. So Joe there was alluding to Hillary Clinton, who's obviously a big part of that. And it's been really cool because it happened really spontaneously. I wrote an article about the misogyny that we hadn't reckoned with at the heart of the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, and how, the right wing has been using Nancy Pelosi as the go-to boogeyman for decades now, in a way that is not just she's the political opponent, but that she is fundamentally evil, and kind of warped, and all this ties into, you know, her transgressing of social norms, you know, the fact that she deserves to be punished for kind of seeking power, for being openly ambitious, for sitting at a table where everyone else is men. So a literary agent kind of reached out to me and asked if I wanted to expand that thesis into a book. So that's what I've been working on. It starts in 1992 with the Year of the Woman and Anita Hill. Um, and the whole idea of it is just to kind of re-excavate this our recent modern political history and pick out this theme of how the implicit or explicit threat of violence kind of works to keep women out of politics, and how that is such like a key element of how we are so far behind peer nations, you know, both with women in the legislature and obviously in the executive role, and then how there are these kind of insidious forces that further and solidify that dynamic, which, you know, are kind of the right-wing media ecosystem and the development of social media and the rise of Trumpism and how that all kind of weaves in. So, you know, early stages, we'll see if it sees the light of day, but that's what I've been working on.
I think I hope it sees the light of day. I'm excited about that. Okay, we
Thanks.
have some time left. If you have a question for Kate, feel free to drop it in and I'll read those in a little while. You can use like the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Before we get to that though, we talk a lot. There's a certain theater in DC. I won't out you. I know you go to a lot of movies and you have a specific favorite theater. What is your favorite movie you've seen this year so far?
Okay, so I was like afraid to say this because I checked the Rotten Tomatoes after I was gonna say it, and it's like really bad. So I was like, okay, people are gonna think I have like terrible taste in movies. But I have to say, none of the movies I've really seen in theaters this year have like wowed me. There are some that I've liked, but none that I would see again, which is kind of my metric for loving a movie. But I did watch this movie directed by the guy who does It Follows, which is this really good and fascinating horror movie. And I love scary movies. So I kind of wanted to see what else he's done. And he'd only done two other movies. And one of them was this one, which I'm going to nominate, which is called Under the Silver Lake. And it's kind of Andrew Garfield is the lead, and it's a noir in LA. And you know, some people like take issue because it's very it has a lot of like overt references to other noirs, which, you know, is there's a rich history of LA
Yeah.
noirs. But I thought it was good because it was kind of I just thought it was fascinating because it was about this kind of like underemployed, you know, mid 30s white dude who just goes down this like conspiratorial rabbit hole and just starts seeing conspiracies everywhere all around him. And it's very unclear what's real and what's his kind of just psychological unraveling. And I thought it was just, it felt like a movie of this moment, of this do your own research, kind of everything is orchestrated, seeing vast, complex, sophisticated conspiracies underlying everything, when in reality, our conspiracies are always more boring than that, you know, and they're
Mhm.
always more pedestrian and more like what you think they are, you know? So I found it really fascinating.
I have not seen that. I don't think I'm actually on the other we've talked about this. I'm on the other end of the spectrum. It takes a lot to get me to see horror movies.
Yeah.
But that one, I don't know. I want to check that one out. I feel like the last like true horror movie that I like really loved was probably The Witch. I'm trying,
Oh,
there might
I
have been
love
one
that
since
movie.
that, but I love The Witch.
It's so
Um,
good.
okay, so you also have read more books. Literally, I think you read more books than anyone I've ever met. You like constantly go through like four for every of my one, probably more than that. And you also support the libraries. You're always getting books from the libraries, and I'm
Hmm.
clearly wasting money buying them.
No, your books are beautiful. You buy
Okay.
pretty books.
So what is a book that you would recommend that you've read recently that maybe people would be familiar with, it wouldn't be top of mind?
Yeah. So luckily, I keep a note open of my phone where I have a list of books that I've loved and books that I've liked. Because I was always running into this when people found out I like to read and would like ask, like, "Oh, what have you been reading?" And my mind is completely blank, and I'm like, "Have I ever read a book in my life? I can't even remember one." So I was kind of looking at this list, and one that I would recommend for this current moment, it's called Fight Night by Miriam, I think Toes. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but she wrote Women Talking, which got turned into a movie with Frances McDormand.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
And that one was really good too, but that one's really dark. And Fight Night is about this kind of three generational household with a grandma, a mom, and the daughter. And it's just one of those rare books where I was like laughing aloud while I was reading it. It's just kind of, I mean, it's poignant, but it's fun and it's loving and tender and kind of, about the beauty of interpersonal human relationships, which I think we could all just use a hearty dose of at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm doing this thing, I've mentioned it too, where uh I only read books that people have given me. And
I love that.
I think this is a tough one because I have a lot of books I want to read, but I read based on like I get in the mood for a specific kind of thing. And if I'm not in the right mood, it's really hard to read something. So kind of like constricting my options has been tough. I found a loophole though, which is if I have gift cards to Barnes and Noble or Amazon sitting around, I can buy myself a book using the gift card, but that feels like it's actually a gift from someone else. So that's been
Totally.
my
No, I
lifesaver.
love that. My like book strategy is if I read one book by someone that I like, I just read absolutely everything else that that author has written. And I sometimes just like go a little bit crazy and get a little bit excited. And this was like a couple years ago, but I got to the library and I had 19 books on hold for myself. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm not going to be able to physically tote these home. And I had to bring them up to the librarian in shifts. And she was like, you probably didn't expect these all to come in at the same time. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Okay, producer Jackie has a question of what is your book club this month? What is the book club book this month?
Unfortunately, I skipped book club this month. I think the most recent book club book I read was it was called Strange Sally Diamond, which to be frank was like a pretty blatant ripoff of another book that I liked a lot better called Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. So that my book club really like the women in it, but it tends towards your more beachy reads, your more super popular books, which I also have a bias against because I refuse to buy a book. Like the only books that I buy are books that I really, really love and that I want to kind of have at my fingertips. And so I'm like not going to buy a book for book club that I
Mhm.
very well might hate. So I'm only again I'm from the
Yeah.
library. So if like we're reading a book that came out in 2024, I'm like, well, guess what, ladies? I'm going to read whatever Google preview there is of this and that's about it because I know the waiting line is going to be like 500 people long for this.
Okay, let's get into what I think you really wanted to talk about most, which is the WNBA. Now,
Always.
huge WNBA fan. I've gotten into it lately, thanks to my wife mostly, but not just because of that. So let's start with obviously Caitlyn Clark. If you're watching this and you have no idea what we're talking about, first of all, how? Second of all, though, Caitlin Clark is a rookie who came into the WNBA this year, probably the most or probably the most publicly anticipated
Yeah.
entrant to the WNBA, maybe ever, because of what she did at Iowa in college, has become somewhat of a lightning rod, as fans come who are really more Caitlin Clark fans than WNBA fans. Has become a very controversial figure, not necessarily of her own doing. But what is your take on her experience, on the Caitlin Clark experience thus far?
Yeah. So see, I'm a Mystics fan, right? That's the DC team. And my fiance and I have had season tickets pre Caitlin Clark. So we've kind of witnessed firsthand the Caitlyn Clark boom. And here's the thing. I have no beef with Caitlyn Clark. I think she's very talented. I think she's having kind of a hell of a rookie season, particularly because she gets blitzed every time she's on the court. We just played her. Our last game was against Indiana at home, and she almost single-handedly kind of made up a 20-point deficit in the fourth quarter. We made some sloppy turnovers, but no, look, she's talented, really talented. And of course, like the friction with Caitlyn Clark comes because the WNBA is a 75% Black league. And now you kind of have this white girl coming in and suddenly everyone cares, right? And the game has been really good for a long time. And the women in the league had to like fight and scrap for every iota of attention, for the measly pay they get, for, you know, the still really uneven resources they play with. And so I think it makes sense that it rubs people the wrong way, that kind of she comes in and it's all of a sudden people are like, wow, the W is great, you know, and they get charter flights when she comes in and all this kind of stuff. So I mean, I think that's why she's been a lightning rod. I think she's been like she hasn't said anything really controversial. Some people feel like she doesn't use her platform enough to kind of push back, but I mean, I think she has. And I think she's a kid, you know, she's like 22 and is thrust into this massive spotlight. Um, the real problem is not Caitlyn Clark, it's her fans who are so annoying, I say with love, because for instance, we the Mystics beat Caitlyn Clark's team, the Fever, this past week, and the Mystics are having a rough go of it. We went 0 of 12 to start the season. So the wins are precious. And then you go on the WNBA Reddit, where I spend a lot of time, and every single post is about Caitlyn's stat line and Caitlyn's clips. And you're like, well, we won the freaking game. So where are the posts about us? So, you know, it's just like, it's the classic thing. Whenever something that is more fringe or less mainstream goes more mainstream, and this, I think this genuinely happens with everything, including like bands or art or whatever. The people who've been there for a while get pissed off at these new people who don't know the rules and have the gall to complain about reffing, even though they've watched a total of 20 games, you know? So that's all going on. But I mean, overall, she's fun to watch. And it's about time that the league kind of gets respected and watched and invested in. And the fact that her arrival, the fact that Angel Reese's arrival have helped shift that attention and increase that money and give all the players leverage for when the players agreement you know, comes up for negotiation, which is their kind of their big document to give them, you know, higher salary floors and the flights and maternity leave and all that. Like all of that is for the good, right? And I think there's always annoyances when things have growing pains, but you know, it's all moving in a really positive direction.
It feels to me as like I'm not quite in the I'm not like a new fan because of Caitlyn Clark, but I'm definitely like new. I think this time 2 years ago I wouldn't have been able to name all the teams. I'm curious from your perspective as someone who's followed for a while, like it feels like last year, even before Caitlyn Clark, that the WNBA was kind of starting to approach like escape velocity, where it became like a real entity. It's getting more coverage. First, I guess, would you agree with that? And then second, like, how do you feel just generally about the WNBA and its growth trajectory and like where it's headed?
So the thing with the W is like it's not been a linear thing. Like it has kind of peaked before. I mean, like you look at the Houston Comets, which are no longer in existence, but they won 4 titles. So, you know, there have been like ups and downs, and interest grows and it wanes. And some of that has to do with star power, right? I mean, that was true with the NBA too. It took what, 20 years for the NBA to become profitable. And like a lot of that had to do with kind of the personalities coming in and the rivalries and building up the personas of the team and everything. So I think that's been happening with the W as well. But, you know, when we got season tickets to the Mystics a few years ago, they were hard to get. Like they were kind of, and I mean, part of that is the Mystics playing a small arena, but no, I think even before Caitlyn, it was growing. People were getting interested in it. Part of that is that just the players in the W are much more like of all the kind of major sports teams are much more comfortable with kind of like activism and getting into a political sphere. And so, 2020 was a big year for the league, and they did a lot of activism around kind of the police brutality protests and wearing that on their chest very proudly. The Dream in particular, the Atlanta Dream, was owned by Kelly Loeffler, who listeners will remember was a senator and was up for reelection against Raphael Warnock in the election that ended up deciding control of the Senate. And they made an all-out activist push to kind of renounce her ownership and get the team sold to someone else. And like that stuff is so cool. That is not something that is, I think, common in a lot of other leagues where that very much try to be apolitical so as to kind of not lose eyeballs and money. So I already think there was that kind of cultural crossbreeding was already happening. And then whenever people kind of come to the W and go to a game and watch them, like, I mean, I hear this from everyone. They have a great time. It's a great product. It's really fun. In some ways, the game is more kind of team oriented than it is on the men's side. So it's like prettier basketball, So, all the pieces have been in place. And now you have this big boom. And now we're getting a new team in the Bay Area in 25, and then a team in Toronto in 26. And please God, a team in my hometown of Philly at some point, because it's so embarrassing that we don't have one. So, it was already kind of I think the stars were kind of aligned for this influx of new viewers.
Okay. This is the last chance to get questions in. Right now, there are no questions. So you'd go right to the top of the line if anyone wants to submit a question. If not, this will be my last question to you, which is,
okay,
you mentioned you're a Mystics fan, and the Mystics have fallen on hard times.
That's right.
Sorry.
That's right.
So let's say that you could guarantee that Joe Biden or, another Democratic nominee would become the president this time. We don't know what happens in 2028 and beyond, but in 2024, the Democratic nominee wins the presidency. But in exchange, the Mystics never win a title the rest of your life. Are you going to take that deal?
Oh my God, this is so hard and so unfair. I obviously have to take Biden or the other Democrat because the alternative is so selfish.
Okay.
But let me just say this. The Mystics won the title in 2019, and due to COVID, never got a parade. And I think
I
that's
didn't
like
know that.
the most horrible, unfair thing I've ever heard, especially because we're currently in this period. I think it'll be short-lived because parity is growing across the league, but we're in this current time of like kind of dynasty rule a little bit, which are the Las Vegas Aces and then your wife Amanda's home team of the New York Liberty. So, it feels like we're in this hole that we have to climb out of, and they didn't even fully get to like enjoy the spoils of winning the whole enchilada last time. So yeah, I'm gonna pick to save democracy, but let it be known that I'm doing it a little bit grudgingly. Yeah.
All right. So, Kate, this has been awesome. Is there anything I didn't ask or that you wanted to talk about that didn't come up? Anything at all?
I was going to end on this little, I don't know, maybe it's kind of a cheesy note, but I've just heard from a lot of readers and listeners of our, the Josh Marshall podcast that I co-host, that people are like really struggling, like it's a hard time. If you're kind of invested in the trajectory of our country, this past like month or so has been, it's been brutal, and I'm hearing from people who feel like they're carrying it with them all the time and they don't know, it's not something they feel that they can just kind of disconnect from because it's not just like a hobby. It's really important. And I would just say that it's really good that all of you care so much and that you're so worried. And it's really good to be invested kind of in your country and to be so repulsed by the, the chaos and the danger and just the meanness that the Trump movement represents. So I just wanted to say, as someone who, along with you, Joe, is just like, we're in this stew every day because of the nature of our jobs. There's some things I do that like really help me. I run on the river every day, I go on long bike rides. We have this big garden on our balcony and I sit out there and I read library books and drink beers on patios with friends. And I just wanted to say that if we've learned anything this past decade, it's just the struggle is bigger than Trump and will likely survive. If he ever dies, will kind of continue. And just that in order to kind of stay focused and energized and invested, which I think is really important, you also need to take care of yourself and remind yourself of all that's worth protecting and saving. So yeah, just that. Just take care of yourself in these kind of tough weeks, and the ship will right itself. Like I think, there are brighter days ahead.
That is extremely well said. So I'm glad you added that at the end. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Kate. Again, Jackie, thank you for when you edit this afterwards. And thanks for everyone that joined us. Thanks for being a member. Thanks for supporting us. And we'll be back next month. I'll be talking to somebody else behind the scenes here at Inside TPM. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe.
Take care.